The Small Faces were a mod rock band from London with quite a confusing history. I'm going to do my best to give you a simplified version of it, and apologies if I even so I'm still confusing. So they started as an R&B cover band in 1965. They were somewhat fronted by a guy called Steve Marriott. 3 albums in, the third being hailed as an absolute classic, Ogden's Nut Gun Flake. Marriott left in the middle of a New Year's Eve gig. He shouted, "I quit," and walked out. He went off to join with Peter Frampton to form a band called Humble Pie that many people will have heard of. The remainder of the band picked up a couple of strays from the Jeff Beck band by the name of Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood, who both went on to huge things, and a couple of others, and became, for a short period, a band called Quiet Melon. Those extra 2 left, and they became The Faces, or mostly so because certainly one album was marketed in America as The Small Faces. And they basically existed as The Faces until 1975, when apparently The Faces broke up, but then they reconvened with some of the originals to become The Small Faces again, which lasted until 1978 and produced 2 more albums. Steve Marriott went on after 1978 when the Small Faces had broken up. Again, Steve Marriott went on to a reformed version of Humble Pie, but they sometimes performed under the name The Small Faces. Kenny Jones, who'd been around all the way through this until 1975, I believe, went on to join The Who and replace Keith Moon. Hi, my name's Dan. So this was... the band history is confusing. This album is also somewhat confusing. So this album was the album that was released in the US as There Are But Small Faces. Now, Acclaimed Music lists this as 2 titles, the first one being Small Faces. So there was another album called Small Faces, which was their second album to be released in the UK, which has most of the same tracks as this album, There Are But Small Faces. Confusingly, also their first album in the UK was also called Small Faces, just to keep things absolutely clear. So I listened to the US version. I'm not entirely sure I can remember when I was sourcing this album why I particularly chose to go with the US version. I think I might not have been able to find the UK version easily. Anyway, that's the provenance, and let's get into the description. So I would describe this as being rock, certainly with a psychedelic leaning, and some blues influence in here as well. There's the kind of classic sets of instruments here for a rock band of this era: the guitars, bass, drums, rock organ, piano. There is harpsichord in here as well, and I'm not sure what else. There's other stuff going on. Their musicality and approach there's quite a bit of variety going on here, but there were several times that I was reminded of the classic song Maggie May by Rod Stewart. Not that they all sound like a carbon copy of that, it's just the approach to music was similar to that. And I think they were very much in the same kind of world. Maggie May was a bit later than this, but around that sort of time. Maybe it's a bit more experimental, I would say, than that. So there are a couple of things. There was certainly starting to play around with studio techniques and interesting things to make different sounds. The first track, Ichiku Park, has apparently got the first use of flanging on a song that was released, which is a technique that is done by having 2 versions, 2 copies of the song being played on 2 tape machines, and very slightly slowing one down by touching the flange on the ring of the tape. There's another track, I can't remember which one, which at the end has a really smooth, nicely done slow down, which again is a studio technique at the end of the track. So there's quite a bit of mild experimentation going on here. in the recordings. The lead vocals are shared. They're mostly Steve Marriott, though, and generally, I would say they're strong. They're a bit rough around the edges, but there's some nice expressiveness in here. So the first track on the album, as I mentioned, is Ichiku Park, which is a stone cold classic. It's really hard to have much interest in music and not have come across this. The other track that I knew on the album before listening to it is Here Come the Nice, and it happens both of those tracks are about drugs. Just going to pick out one other, which is Up the Wooden Hills, is about going to bed. On the English version, it's called Up the Wooden Hills to Bedfordshire. The other songs are generally about, sometimes about relationships, sometimes about more psychedelic things. So Tin Soldier is maybe a bit about both, but there was this psychedelic thing about making songs or writing songs about kind of everyday objects and things. And there's bits of that on here as well. As a whole, in retrospect, I think it suffers a little from the weight of Ichiku Park and it being so well known that when you get into the rest of the album, it feels like Ichiku Park is kind of the weight on the rubber sheet that's pulling everything else in towards it. But I think that's just because of how well known it is, rather than that it is particularly strong compared to the rest of it. I would say overall it is a pretty strong album, but I think it's a little unfocused by the standards of where we get to into the early 70s and a bit further. I don't think that was unusual at this point, 1967, for things to feel a bit like this. So yeah, I'm a reasonable fan of this album. I think it's quite a good album. And as always, I'd love to know what you think of this album. So please do tell me what you think by typing it into the comments box. I read all comments and we get a conversation flowing quite often. And that's great. So please talk to me. That's it from me for now.
Here come the nights, looking so good. He makes me feel like no one else could. He knows what I want. He's got what I need. He's always there if I need some speed.